The first thing Caleb ever heard the foreman say wasn't a hello. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a proper sentence. It was two words, spoken so low they barely existed, and yet they hit him square in the chest like a fist wrapped in velvet. Good boy. Caleb had been hauling hay bales since 5 in the morning. His arms ached. His back was screaming at him in that deep, specific way that only comes from real physical labor, the kind of pain that feels almost like pride. The sun had barely cracked open over the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting everything in that thin gold light that makes even ugly things look beautiful. He just dropped the third bale of the morning, straightened up, rolled his shoulders, and turned around, and there he was, standing in the shadow of the barn door, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes that color of creek water after a storm, greenish-gray and impossible to read. Caleb waited for something more, a correction maybe, an instruction, a reason those two words had been said at all, but the foreman just uncrossed his arms, turned, and walked back into the dark of the barn like he'd never been there. Caleb stood alone in the hayfield for a long moment. The dew was still on the grass. The mountains were going pink and gold at the edges, and all he had were two words that shouldn't have meant anything and somehow meant everything. He was 18 years old, 1 week on the Hatch farm, and something had already started, quiet as a match being struck in the dark. His name was Eli Voss, foreman at Hatch Farm since he was 23, which made him 26 now, 3 years on Caleb, which felt like both nothing and a canyon depending on the moment. He'd grown up 2 counties over in a town even smaller than Millhaven, the kind of place where you either stayed forever or got out fast. Eli had stayed, not because he couldn't leave, Caleb would learn later, but because the land had hold of him in a way that was almost physical, like roots. He ran the farm with a quiet authority that didn't need volume to land. He never shouted, never threatened. He'd look at you a certain way, or he'd go silent at a specific moment, and somehow that was enough. The other hands, older men, most of them, guys who'd been working farms since before Caleb was born, respected him without question, not feared him. That was the difference. There's a kind of man who commands through intimidation, and then there's a kind of man who commands through something else entirely, something harder to name. Eli was the second kind. Caleb had come to Millhaven running from something he hadn't quite figured out how to put into words yet. His father's dairy farm back in Western Virginia had gone under the summer before, swallowed by debt and drought and bad timing. His parents had moved in with his mother's sister in Roanoke. Caleb had taken the first farm job he could find on a map that wasn't close enough to home to feel like failure, and Hatch Farm had been hearing. He was young. He knew he was young. He felt it constantly in those first weeks, the way the other hands looked at him with something between amusement and mild pity. He was still growing into his own body, broad in the shoulders but not yet settled into it, with dark blonde hair that curled at the ends when he sweated, and a face that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be handsome or just interesting. He worked hard because he had something to prove and nowhere else to put his energy, and he kept his head down and his mouth shut and tried to learn the rhythms of the place as fast as he could. The rhythms, it turned out, were mostly Eli's. Breakfast was at 5:30 in the big common kitchen of the bunkhouse. Work started at 6. Midday break was 45 minutes, no more. Evening work finished with the light. Sundays were half days. These weren't written down anywhere. You just picked them up by watching, and what you were really watching, Caleb realized, was Eli. He set the pace. He set the tone. When he was steady, the whole farm was steady. When something was wrong, you felt it in the air before anyone said a word. That first week, Caleb mostly watched him from a distance. Watched the way he moved through the farm, unhurried but never slow, like he'd calculated exactly how much energy everything required, and gave it precisely that much and no more. Watched the way he talked to the horses, quiet and direct, like they were people worth respecting. Watched the way he'd stand at the edge of the south pasture sometimes in the evening, just before the light went completely, and look out at the mountains with something on his face that Caleb couldn't interpret. Something private, something that felt like it didn't belong to anyone else. He told himself he was just learning the farm, learning the rhythms. It was practical, it was professional. He told himself that for about 3 weeks. The first real conversation they had happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week, when a section of the east fence had come down in a storm the night before, and Caleb had been sent out to fix it. He'd been working for 2 hours in the wrong direction, post-hole digger sinking into ground that was too rocky, before Eli showed up. He didn't say you're doing it wrong. He didn't say anything at first. He just walked the fence line for a minute, looking at the ground, then picked up a stake, drove it with one efficient motion about 4 feet to the left of where Caleb had been digging and said, "Softer here. Storm drains this way." Caleb looked at where the stake had landed, then at where he'd been working. He felt heat climb up the back of his neck. "I've been digging for 2 hours," he said. "I know," Eli said. "No accusation in it, just a fact." Caleb stared at him for a moment. He wanted to be annoyed. He'd been sweating in the sun for 2 hours for nothing. But there was something in the way Eli said it, not unkind, not amused at his expense, just direct, that made annoyance feel like the wrong response. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" he asked instead. Eli looked at him, that creekwater gaze steady and unhurried. "You needed to learn the ground," he said. "Sometimes you learn it by getting it wrong first." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the stake in the softer ground, then picked up the digger and moved to where Eli had indicated and started over. They worked together for the next 2 hours without saying much. Eli was economical with words the way he was economical with everything, not cold, not unfriendly, just precise. When he spoke, it was to point something out or confirm something. But there was a quality to the silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. It felt, Caleb thought, like the silence of two people who don't need to fill space with noise just to feel okay about being near each other. When the fence was done, they stood back and looked at it. The sun was getting low, turning the field amber, the mountains going purple in the distance. Caleb was tired down to his marrow and weirdly satisfied in the way that only finishing something physical and real can make you feel. "You're quick once you know what you're doing," Eli said. It was such a small thing to say. It shouldn't have meant anything. Caleb had been complimented on his work before, plenty of times, but something about this one landed differently. Something about the way Eli said it, matter of fact, no performance in it, like he was simply reporting something true, made it feel more like being seen than being praised. "Thanks," Caleb said. His voice came out a little rough. He told himself it was just the dust. Eli nodded once, picked up his tools and walked back toward the barn. Caleb watched him go. The sun was almost down. The mountains were that deep purple-gray now, and the first stars were starting to show. He stayed there a little longer than he needed to. He was definitely not watching for practical reasons anymore. The thing about slow burns is that they're only obvious in retrospect. When you're inside them, living them day by day, you don't feel the heat building. You just notice small things, details that shouldn't register but do. The way someone moves their hands when they're explaining something. The particular quality of their laugh when they're genuinely amused versus when they're just being polite. The exact angle of their jaw when they're thinking. You collect these details without meaning to, without even realizing you're doing it. And one day you reach into your chest to pull out a casual feeling and find something much larger and heavier there instead. For Caleb, it happened gradually and then all at once. Gradually, the weeks passing, the work deepening, the conversations between him and Eli becoming something more than functional. Eli asking him once in that straightforward way of his, where he'd learned to handle horses, and Caleb telling him about his father's farm, about the smell of hay and engine oil in hard mornings, and Eli listening with his full attention in a way that made Caleb feel like the most interesting person in any room he'd ever been in. Then Eli telling him in return small things, not much, not personal exactly, but enough. That he'd wanted to be a vet once. That he read when he couldn't sleep. That the mountains in this particular light at this particular time of year reminded him of something good, something he couldn't quite name. Small offerings, but offerings nonetheless. All at once, a Friday evening in early October, 6 weeks into Caleb's time on the farm, when the whole sky had gone the color of a bruise, and a storm was coming in fast, and they were trying to get the horses in before it hit. They were both running, the wind picking up, the first fat drops of rain starting to fall. Caleb had gotten the last mare into her stall and was latching the door when he turned and ran directly into Eli, who'd come around the corner at the same moment. They both stumbled. Eli caught Caleb's arm. Caleb grabbed the front of Eli's jacket. For about 2 seconds they were very close, closer than they'd ever been, Eli's hand warm and firm through the fabric of Caleb's sleeve. Caleb's fingers curled into the damp canvas of Eli's jacket, their faces maybe 8 inches apart. The rain was starting in earnest now, drumming on the barn roof, and the world outside the door was going gray and wild. But inside the stall corridor it was warm and close and smelled like hay and horses, and the particular clean scent of rain just starting. Eli looked at him, not the way he usually looked at him, that steady, assessing look. This was different. This was something that flickered and then was quickly, carefully controlled, like a window opened for a second and then shut. He let go of Caleb's arm, stepped back. "Good catch," he said. His voice was completely level. Caleb released the jacket, stepped back too. "Yeah," he said. His voice was not level at all. They went about securing the barn in the storm, working side by side in the dim light, the rain beating against the walls, and neither of them said another word for the rest of the evening. But Caleb lay awake in his bunk that night with his heart doing something inconvenient and rhythmically excessive. And he finally, honestly, without any room left for arguing with himself, admitted what was happening. He had feelings for Eli Voss. He had enormous, complicated, terrifying, wonderful feelings for Eli Voss, his foreman, his employer in the practical sense, 3 years older than him and a world more settled, who said things like "good boy" in quiet fields at sunrise and caught you in barn corridors during storms and looked at you sometimes with those creekwater eyes like you were something worth looking at. Caleb stared at the bunk above him for a long time. Outside the rain was still coming down. The farm was quiet except for the weather. He'd known, somewhere inside himself, that he could feel this way about another man. It wasn't new information about himself exactly. It was more like a door he'd been standing in front of for years, knowing it was there, not opening it. Small-town Virginia. A father who loved him but had strong opinions. The careful performance of being a certain kind of boy growing up, easier and less exhausting than the alternative. He'd gotten good at not looking too closely at certain things, at steering his own attention away from certain rooms in himself. But lying in his bunk in the bunkhouse on Hatch Farm with the rain coming down and the memory of Eli's hand warm on his arm, he found he didn't have the energy to look away anymore. He was 18. He was alone in a new place. He was already running from something. What would it cost to stop running from this too? He didn't know the answer to that yet, but he held the feeling anyway, let himself hold it fully for the first time, turned it over in the dark like something precious and sharp-edged. Then he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. It took a while. October deepened. The leaves on the ridgeline turned and the mornings got cold enough to see your breath, and the work on the farm shifted with the season, more focus on the horses, on the hay stores, on winterizing the outbuildings. Caleb had settled into the work by now, the rhythms comfortable, his body adjusted to the physical demands. The other hands had accepted him in the quiet, gradual way that men who work outdoors together accept each other, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of steady inclusion. He had a place here now. That was enough. He and Eli worked together most days. This wasn't unusual as foreman. Eli worked alongside everyone, directing and participating in equal measure. But there was something particular about how often their tasks overlapped, how often they ended up at the same job at the same time. Caleb didn't know if this was deliberate on Eli's part or just the natural result of proximity and competence. He tried not to read into it. He was moderately unsuccessful at this. The conversations had gotten longer, less about work, though they always started there. Eli would be showing him something about the equipment or a particular horse's temperament, and then somehow, incrementally, they'd have drifted into something else entirely. Books, the nature of small towns, what you did with a life that wanted to go in one direction while the world kept pointing you in another. Eli didn't talk about himself easily or at length, but what he did share he shared with a kind of directness that felt like trust. Like he'd decided Caleb was worth being honest with. And Caleb, who was still learning to be honest with himself about certain things, found that quality in Eli, that steady willingness to just say what was true, both compelling and faintly intimidating. There was an afternoon in mid-October when they were cleaning out the smaller barn, the one used for equipment storage, which had gotten cluttered over the summer. It was a cold day, bright and still, the kind of October afternoon in the mountains that feels like a gift before winter takes everything. They'd been working for a couple of hours, moving things around, sorting, sweeping. The radio in the barn was playing something old and country, the kind of song that has a certain ache built into its melody. Caleb was up on a ladder reaching for something on a high shelf when the ladder shifted. It was a small shift, barely significant, but he grabbed the shelf above him on reflex and knocked a stack of old binders down. They cascaded off the shelf, and Eli, who'd been standing several feet away, moved fast, faster than Caleb would have expected, and was there at the base of the ladder, one hand on the side to stabilize it, by the time Caleb had steadied himself. "You okay?" Eli asked. "Fine," Caleb said. "Just yeah, thanks." He climbed down. When he got to the bottom rung and stepped off, he found he'd misjudged how close Eli was standing, and they were suddenly, again, very close. Eli hadn't moved. He was looking at Caleb with something that wasn't quite the usual evenness, something that had a question in it. Caleb should have stepped back. He didn't, for about 2 seconds longer than he should have. 2 seconds in which he was intensely aware of Eli's proximity, the warmth coming off him, the particular smell of the barn and the cold air, and something that was just Eli, cedar and hay, and something clean underneath. Then Eli stepped back and the moment closed. "Watch the ladder," he said, completely steady. "Yeah," Caleb said. His heart was running fast. He went back to work. They both did. The radio played its aching old songs, and the afternoon light came through the barn door in long golden shafts, and Caleb sorted equipment with hands that weren't quite steady and told himself to get it together. The hard part was that Eli didn't make it easy. He wasn't flirtatious, nothing so clear or readable as that, but there was something in the attention he gave Caleb that felt different from how he talked to the other hands, a quality of seeing, like he noticed things, small things, the way Caleb got quiet when he was working through something difficult, the way he favored his left hand slightly when his right shoulder was bothering him. Once, when Caleb had had a harder day than usual and was eating dinner with the silence turned in around him, Eli had said nothing at all but had set a cup of coffee next to his plate and kept moving. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of thing that shouldn't mean anything. Caleb thought about it for approximately 4 days. There was another hand on the farm named Marcus. He'd been there for 2 seasons, was maybe 22, and was the kind of person whose energy filled whatever room he walked into, loud in a good-natured way, quick with a joke, easy to be around. He liked Caleb immediately and loudly, the way extroverts sometimes just decide to adopt quiet people, and Caleb liked him back, genuinely. Marcus made the farm feel less lonely. But Marcus also had a habit, in the way of socially perceptive people who aren't always careful about what they perceive out loud, of noticing things. "You're watching him again," Marcus said one evening in early November. They were on the porch of the bunkhouse after dinner, the cold air sharp and clean, the stars ridiculous in number the way they only get in the country far from city light. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caleb said. Sure, Marcus said. He was whittling something, which was a habit of his that Caleb had stopped finding unexpected. Eli's been foreman here since I started. I've never seen him talk to anyone like he talks to you. Caleb was quiet. Not saying anything, Marcus said, just observing. Then stop observing, Caleb said, but there was no heat in it. Marcus grinned, kept whittling. He's a good man, you know, quiet but good. The real kind of good, not the performed kind. Caleb looked out at the dark. The mountains were black shapes against a sky thick with stars. Somewhere in the distance an owl called once and then went quiet. I know, he said. Marcus nodded, didn't say anything else, which Caleb appreciated more than he could say. The thing about being young and feeling something large for the first time is that there's no scale for it, nothing to compare it against. You don't know yet which feelings are the earth-shifting kind and which are just the season's weather. Caleb had been attracted to boys before. In the cautious, sealed-off way he'd trained himself to feel things without acting on them. But this was different. This was layered in a way those earlier feelings hadn't been. It wasn't just that he was drawn to Eli physically, though he was, quietly and persistently, it was the whole of him, the steadiness, the intelligence, the way he'd say something true and then not need you to respond, just leave it there for you to pick up or put down, the way he listened, the way he moved through the world like it didn't frighten him but he respected it nonetheless. Caleb had never wanted someone's good opinion as much as he wanted Eli's. That itself felt significant, grown up in a way he was still adjusting to. He also had absolutely no idea what to do about any of it. So he did what 18-year-olds have always done with the things they don't know what to do about. He kept his head down, worked harder, and hoped something would clarify itself without him having to act. November was cold. Not the mountain cold that would come in January, not yet, but the November kind that reminds you winter is real and coming and you'd better be ready. The horses needed more care. The mornings were dark longer. The work was different, heavier somehow, even if the tasks were the same. The season had weight. One evening after work, a Thursday, Caleb found himself in the stable alone. He'd stayed late to check on one of the mares, an older horse named Dusty who'd been slightly off her feed, and everyone else had gone in for the night. He was sitting on a hay bale near her stall, just watching her, making sure she was settling, when he heard footsteps and looked up and found Eli in the stable doorway. Thought you'd gone in, Eli said. Wanted to check on Dusty, Caleb said. Eli came over, looked at the mare. She was calm now, eating steadily. She's all right, he said. Yeah, Caleb said. I think it was just the change in the feed. Eli nodded. He didn't leave. He leaned against the stall post and looked at Dusty for a moment, then looked at Caleb. You do that, he said. Caleb looked up at him. Do what? Stay, Eli said. After, make sure things are settled. He said it simply, not like a compliment exactly, more like an observation, something noted. Caleb felt the warmth in his chest that Eli's attention always produced, and which he was getting worse and worse at managing. Doesn't everyone? He said. No, Eli said. There was a quiet then, the kind that Caleb had gotten used to between them, easy, without pressure. The stable was warm with the animals, smelling of hay and old wood, and the cold air coming in through the high windows. Can I ask you something? Caleb said. He wasn't sure he'd planned to say that. It came out on its own. Eli looked at him, that steady look, sure. Caleb was quiet for a moment, trying to find the shape of what he wanted to say. That first morning, he said finally, when I was hauling hay, you said he stopped. He felt slightly ridiculous now. I know what I said, Eli said. His voice was completely even. Caleb looked at him. Eli was looking at the mare now, not at Caleb, his jaw set in that way he had. Why did you say it? Caleb asked. Eli was quiet for a moment. Because it was true, he said. That's not really an answer, Caleb said. Eli looked at him then, that creek-water gaze and something underneath it that was almost something more open than usual. You were working like you had something to prove, he said. Harder than you needed to. Better than anyone expected you to be, day one. He paused. I said it because you looked like you needed to hear something good. Caleb stared at him. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected something so direct, so seen. Like Eli had looked at him that first morning and understood something about him without needing it explained. I was running from something, Caleb said before he could stop himself. He wasn't sure why he was telling Eli this now. Maybe because Eli had just offered him honesty, and honesty seemed to call for honesty back. I know, Eli said quietly. Caleb looked at him. How? Because people who work that hard in the first week are always running from something, Eli said. He wasn't being unkind about it. He was just saying a true thing. Doesn't matter what. You were here. You were working. That's what counted. They looked at each other for a moment. The stable was very quiet. Dusty shifted in her stall, the soft, heavy sound of a large animal settling. What are you running from? Caleb asked. He didn't know where that came from either. Something moved in Eli's expression, something that came and went too fast for Caleb to read. Then the evenness returned and he pushed off the stall post. Nothing, he said. Not anymore. He said goodnight and walked out. Caleb sat on the hay bale in the warm stable for a long time after that, with the horses breathing around him and the cold stars showing through the high windows, feeling like he'd almost understood something, and then had it slip just out of reach. December arrived, and with it the farm's quieter season. Fewer people on the property, less urgency in the daily work, more time between tasks. This meant more time in proximity to Eli, which was both a gift and a specific kind of torment that Caleb was learning to navigate. They'd fallen into a habit, without either of them nomming it or pointing at it, of taking their coffee in the barn most mornings before the other hands arrived. It had started accidentally. They'd both just happened to be there one cold morning, each with a thermos, and then it had just kept happening. By December it was something Caleb looked forward to with a sharpness that he tried to keep quiet inside himself. 20 minutes, sometimes less. Just the barn and the horses and the thin early light and Eli, who drank his coffee black and leaned on the stall door, and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't. On a December morning, the first significant frost of the season on the windows and the mountains white at the peaks, Eli said, "You ever think about staying?" Caleb looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "Here," Eli said, "past the season." Caleb hadn't thought about it explicitly, but the moment Eli said it he realized he had been thinking about it, somewhere under the conscious level, for weeks. The idea of leaving this farm, this valley, this routine, felt like the idea of leaving a warmth he'd only just found. "I don't know," he said honestly. Eli nodded. He was looking at one of the horses, not at Caleb. "Mr. Hatch would keep you on," he said. "If you wanted to stay, I'd recommend it." Caleb looked at him. Something careful and warm expanded in his chest. "You'd recommend me." "You're good at this," Eli said, simple and direct as always. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Is that the only reason you're asking?" he said. His voice came out quieter than he meant it to. Eli looked at him then, fully, directly, that rare, full-attention look that he gave to very few things. The barn was quiet around them. The frost was blue-white on the windows. Something was very present in the space between them. "No," Eli said, "just that." Caleb's heart was doing something dramatic and unmeasured. "Okay," he said. Eli held his gaze for one more moment, then looked away, finished his coffee, set the thermos down. "Horses need their morning check," he said, and went to work. Caleb stood in the barn alone for a moment with his coffee getting cold in his hands, and the word no still ringing in his chest like a bell. It was the most Eli had ever said while saying almost nothing, and it was enough, for now, to make the whole cold December morning feel like it was lit from somewhere inside. The week before Christmas, something shifted. A man came to the farm, name of Daniel. He was from the county agricultural office, which meant he came in a truck with a seal on the door and had a clipboard, but he was also unmistakably someone who'd grown up in this world. He knew the land, the work, the language of farming. He was around Eli's age, good-looking in an easy, uncomplicated way, and he knew Eli. How he knew Eli, Caleb didn't ask. Didn't need to. The way they talked, easy and familiar with the shorthand of shared history, told him what he needed to know. This was someone from before. From the life Eli had before Millhaven, maybe, or from some intersection of their pasts that Caleb hadn't been there for. Daniel was around for 3 days, doing some kind of assessment of the farm's operations. He was friendly enough, competent, clearly doing his job well. Caleb had no reason to feel anything about him. He felt things about him immediately. Not dislike exactly. Something more uncomfortable than that. Something that came with a sick recognition of its own nature that made Caleb profoundly annoyed at himself. He watched Eli and Daniel talking by the equipment shed on the second afternoon, laughing at something. Eli's shoulders loose in a way they usually weren't with people he didn't know well. Daniel's hand landing on Eli's arm briefly in that casual physical way of old friendship, and felt something cold and specific move through him. He went back to work and did not look at them again. That evening, Marcus found him in the tack room, doing maintenance on the bridles with a slightly more aggressive energy than the task required. "Easy on the leather," Marcus said, leaning in the doorway. Caleb said nothing. "County man seems like a decent guy," Marcus offered. "He's fine," Caleb said. "He and Eli go way back, I think," Marcus said. He was looking at the ceiling with the studied innocence of someone who was doing no such thing. From before Eli came here, some kind of friends. "Good for them," Caleb said. He was buffing a bridle into oblivion. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Caleb," he said. "Don't," Caleb said. Marcus nodded, came into the room, sat on a trunk, and quietly started sorting some buckles that didn't particularly need sorting, just so Caleb wasn't alone. He didn't say anything else. Caleb worked on the bridles until his hands steadied, and the cold thing in his chest settled to something dull and manageable. He didn't like feeling this way. It was possessive and irrational and based on absolutely no actual information. He didn't know what Eli felt, what Eli and Daniel were to each other, what any of it meant. He was 18 years old and he'd been here 3 months, and he'd never said a single true thing about his feelings to the person they concerned, and he had no standing to feel what he was feeling. But feelings don't particularly care about standing. On Daniel's last evening, there was a small informal dinner in the farmhouse. Mr. Hatch liked to send off his official visitors properly. It was his way. Caleb went because not going would have been more obvious than going. He sat at the far end of the table and ate his food and kept his eyes on his plate and was very adult and mature about the entire thing. Except once. Once he looked up and Eli was already looking at him. From across the table, through the warm noise of a dinner table, Eli was looking at him with something that wasn't his work face or his foreman face or the careful neutral expression he wore in groups. It was something quieter and more particular, something that asked a question Caleb didn't quite know how to answer. Caleb looked back down at his plate. His face was warm. His heart was not behaving. After dinner, in the cold outside, walking back to the bunkhouse, Marcus fell into step beside him and said absolutely nothing, which was the most tactful thing he'd ever done. 2 days after Daniel left, Caleb made a mistake. Not a dramatic mistake, not the kind that breaks things immediately. A quiet mistake, the kind that has consequences that unfold slowly. He got into his own head. It happened the way these things happen. He woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't stop thinking. About all of it. About the fact that he was 18 and hadn't properly lived yet and didn't know what he was doing. About the fact that Eli was his foreman, technically, and the power differential in that was something real. About the fact that he'd come here running from one thing and had possibly walked directly into another. About Daniel and what that comfortable history meant. about whether what Caleb felt was real love or just loneliness dressed up in better clothes, about whether he was projecting, reading things into small kindnesses and shared silences that weren't actually there. He built a very thorough case against his own feelings. He was good at it. He'd been practicing his whole life. By morning, he had decided to create some distance. Professional distance. Healthy, smart, protective distance. He would do his work, do it well, respect Eli as his foreman, and stop reading poetry into 2-minute silences in barns. He was very resolved about this, very mature, very sensible. For about 4 days it worked. He was courteous and efficient and kept their interactions work-focused. He stopped going to the barn early. He answered when spoken to and then went back to what he was doing. He told himself this felt like health and not like loss. He was not entirely convincing. On the 5th day, Eli looked at him across the pasture and said, "Everything all right?" "Fine," Caleb said. "Good." Eli looked at him, just that, for one long, steady moment in the cold December air. "Okay," he said, and went back to what he was doing. But something in his face when he turned away, something tight, something pulled back, made the bottom drop out of Caleb's stomach in a way that took him a full hour to recover from. That night he lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and felt the loss of something he'd never quite had, and it was more painful than he'd expected. More real. That was the thing about distance. It clarified. When you move away from something, you understand its actual size. His feelings were not weather. They were not loneliness in better clothes. They were specific and enormous, and they had Eli's name on them. He didn't know what to do with that, but he knew pretending otherwise wasn't working. Christmas at the farm was quieter than Caleb expected. Most of the hands went home to family. He stayed, partly because his own family situation was complicated in ways he didn't have energy to navigate, and partly he admitted this to himself, to his credit, because he wasn't ready to leave. Even for a week, even for the holidays. Eli stayed too. Caleb didn't ask why, didn't have to. It was just the two of them and old Mr. Hatch and the farm for 3 days. The work was minimal, just what the animals needed, and then the days were open in an unusual and slightly vertiginous way. Caleb hadn't had unstructured time since he'd arrived at the farm. He didn't quite know what to do with himself. He was in the stable on Christmas Eve afternoon, which had become his default place when he had nowhere particular to be. He'd brought a book, something he'd found on the shelf in the bunkhouse common room, a battered copy of something by Cormac McCarthy that had clearly been read many times, and was sitting on a hay bale not quite reading it, watching Dusty in her stall, when Eli appeared in the stable doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Caleb, sat on the bale beside him, not on a different bale, on the same one, which was a choice, an amount of proximity that was not required by the size of the stable, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of him. They sat like that for a while. The horses were calm around them. Outside, the sky was the particular thick gray of a winter sky considering snow. "You stayed," Eli said, not asking, nodding. "Nothing pulling me away," Caleb said, carefully neutral. Eli was quiet. He drank his coffee. Then he said, "The last few days, you've been different." Caleb looked at the floor, just focused on the work. "Caleb," Eli said. That was all, just his name. But in Eli's voice it had a quality that made Caleb look up, meet his eyes. Eli was looking at him with that full attention thing, that complete openness that he rarely offered, and there was something in it now that wasn't the careful neutral, something that had let the neutral go. "I don't know what I'm doing," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, honest. He was done not being honest, at least with himself. I don't know what to do with how I feel, and I don't want to make things strange, so I thought distance was better." Eli held his gaze. "Does it feel better?" he asked. "No," Caleb said. "Then it isn't better," Eli said, like that was simple, like it was just math. Caleb looked at him. His heart was very loud. I've never done this. Whatever this is, I don't know the rules." "There aren't rules," Eli said. His voice had something in it now, something warmer, less guarded than Caleb had ever heard from him. "That's terrifying," Caleb said, and despite everything there was something almost like a laugh in it. Eli smiled. It was small, but it was real, and Caleb had spent months waiting for it without knowing he was waiting. "I know," he said. "I've been scared too." Caleb looked at him. "You." He couldn't quite keep the disbelief out of his voice. "I've been watching you since your first week," Eli said, simple and direct as always, even in this. "I've been careful because you're young and you work for me, and because I'm not easy with this, with letting people in." He paused. "But you've been in since the fence, since the ladder, since Dusty, without me deciding to let you in. You were just there." Caleb was very still. The barn was very quiet. Outside the sky had gone darker, the snow deciding, and the first flakes were starting to fall. "Since the fence," he said. That had been 6 weeks in. 2 hours working beside each other on a broken fence, barely talking. "Since the fence," Eli said. Caleb looked at him. This person who ran on steadiness and economy and truth, who'd built his whole self around not wasting anything, not words, not energy, not feeling, saying this. Saying I've been scared too. Saying you were just there. He felt something break open in his chest. Not a painful breaking. The other kind. The kind that's been waiting to happen, that's actually a relief. "I didn't know," Caleb said. "I thought I couldn't read you. I kept trying and I couldn't." "Good," Eli said. "I was trying hard not to be read." He looked at Caleb. "I'm not trying anymore." Outside, the snow was beginning in earnest. The mountains were disappearing into white. The stable was warm and close and smelled like hay and horses and everything that had become home to Caleb over these 3 months. They were still side by side on the hay bale. Close. Closer than they'd been in the barn corridor during the storm, and that time had already felt like too much and not enough. Eli lifted his hand and set it over Caleb's, a deliberate, careful gesture, nothing rushed about it, giving Caleb every chance to move or respond or decide. Caleb looked down at their hands. Eli's larger, rougher, more worked by weather and years. Caleb turned his hand over and let their fingers find each other. They sat like that for a long moment. The snow outside, the quiet horses, the warm, dim light of the stable on Christmas Eve. Something irrevocable had just happened, and it had happened so gently, so honestly, with so little performance in it, that Caleb felt tears behind his eyes in a way that surprised him entirely. He wasn't sad. He wasn't frightened. He was something he hadn't been in a very long time. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weeks after Christmas moved differently. Not faster, not slower, but with a different quality, like the same music in a better key. Caleb didn't know how to describe it except that the farm, which had already felt like home, now felt like something more specific than that, like a place with his actual name on it. They were careful. That was something Eli had said simply and directly. "I'd like to be careful." Not because he was ashamed, he was very clear about that, but because the farm was a workplace and he had professional responsibilities, and he was a private person who'd earned that privacy. Caleb understood this, respected it. It suited his own nature anyway. He'd never been someone who wore his heart on the outside. So they were careful in the ways that mattered and unself-conscious in the ways that didn't. Work was work. The horses needed the same tending. The fences needed the same maintaining. The mornings were still cold, and the mountains were still impossibly beautiful in the early light, and none of that had changed. What had changed was smaller and larger than all of it simultaneously. Morning coffee in the barn had not stopped. It had become something Caleb thought was perhaps the best 20 minutes of most days. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes Eli would point at something, the way the frost had formed a particular pattern on the window, or a hawk high over the south pasture, or Dusty doing something characteristically Dusty, and Caleb would look at it and understand that the pointing was itself a form of language. "I see this." I want you to see it too." That was what Eli was saying, with gestures, with attention, with the careful offering of what he noticed to someone he decided was worth offering it to. Marcus, who had the perception of someone who paid attention to everything and the discretion of someone who'd learned when not to use it, had simply continued being Marcus. He'd caught Caleb's eye one morning in February and raised his coffee cup very slightly, a small salute, and then looked away. That was the full extent of what he said about it, and Caleb felt a depth of gratitude for this that surprised him. There were hard moments. There were the expected ones, navigating what it meant to have feelings and a professional relationship layered inside each other. The occasional moment where the line between them felt blurry and required recalibrating. Eli was serious about this, in the way he was serious about things he cared about, which meant working through it with patience and honesty rather than pretending the complexity didn't exist. And there were the unexpected hard moments. Caleb's identity, the part he'd spent years managing carefully and quietly, was still something he was learning to hold openly. He'd held it in tight for so long that even now, with everything changed, the old reflexes still kicked in sometimes. The downward glance in certain company, the edit, the performance. Eli noticed, of course he noticed. "You don't have to protect yourself from me," he said one evening. They were walking the fence line on the east side of the property, the February sky enormous and cold above them, the mountains dusted with snow. He said it without preamble, without building to it. Just set it down between them. Caleb looked at him. He didn't ask what he meant. "I know," he said. "But you still do it," Eli said, not accusatory, just honest. "It's a habit," Caleb said, "a long one." Eli nodded, walked beside him for a moment in that quiet, then said, "I had the same one." Caleb looked at him, past tense. "Mostly," Eli said. He looked ahead at the mountains. "It took a while, and it takes someone making it safe." He paused. "I'm trying to be that for you." Caleb stopped walking. Eli stopped too and turned to look at him. The light was going, the afternoon tipping toward evening, the mountains going deep blue in the shadow. "You are," Caleb said, "you are that." Eli looked at him with that open, unguarded thing that he still showed rarely and that still hit Caleb somewhere deep every time. Then he reached out and briefly, firmly, put a hand on the back of Caleb's neck, warm in the cold air, grounding, and then let go. "Come on," he said. "Fence isn't going to check itself." Caleb walked beside him. His neck was warm where Eli's hand had been. The mountains were going dark and the first stars were showing, and the cold was clean and honest in his lungs. He was not running anymore. That was the thing he kept arriving at from different directions, kept finding true from new angles. He'd come to this farm running, and somewhere, at a fence post in a storm, in a barn on Christmas Eve, walking a fence line in February with someone who had decided he was worth the effort of honesty, he had stopped. He didn't know yet what everything would look like. He was 18. There was a great deal of life that hadn't happened yet and would require figuring out as it arrived. His family, his future beyond this season and the one after. All the large unmapped territories of a young adulthood that had barely started. But he knew what this felt like. He knew the specific weight and quality of feeling safe. And he knew Eli's voice and his hands, and the way he looked at the mountains, and the way he said true things in the quiet of barns and stables and cold field mornings. He knew this, and he was keeping it. Spring came to the farm the way spring comes to mountain valleys, slowly, then all at once. One morning the air was still winter, and then there was a week of rain, and then the pastures were green, and the mountains were their impossible spring green, and the horses were restless and bright-eyed, and the whole farm smelled like mud and new growth and something beginning. Caleb had been on Hatch Farm for 7 months. It felt, in the way that certain periods of your life feel when you're in the middle of them, and also somehow already looking back from the future, like both a short time and an entire chapter, like something that would always be a before and after in the story of how he'd become whatever he was going to become. The afternoon he would remember most when he looked back on this was a Saturday in April. No particular reason for it to be significant. No drama, no climax, no important conversation, just a Saturday. They'd been working since early morning. A full day of spring maintenance, checking the equipment, treating the pasture fences, a full check of all the animals after the winter. By afternoon, they'd ended up in the south pasture, the farthest point from the farmhouse, where the land opened up and you could see the mountains from the full width of the horizon, ridge after ridge going blue in the distance. The sky above them the particular deep April blue that seems to exist only in the mountains. They'd finished what they were doing. They were just standing there. The horses were out in the pasture, moving unhurried, the way horses do when they're happy and have space. The grass was new and green. The air was warm for the first time in months. Eli was beside him, not touching. They were standing in the open pasture in the middle of a workday, but close, near enough. 7 months, Caleb said. I know, Eli said. I almost didn't stay, Caleb said. After the first month, I was going to look for something else. Eli looked at him. Why didn't you? Caleb considered this. The fence, he said. You told me I'd learned the ground by getting it wrong first. He paused. I thought that was a good reason to stay. Something moved in Eli's expression, something warm. Also, Caleb said, I thought you were. He stopped. I thought you were kind in a very quiet way, and I hadn't run into that in a while. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then, I said good boy to a kid I'd never met who was killing himself hauling hay in the dark at 5 in the morning because he needed someone to say something right to him. That was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months, Caleb said. Eli looked at him, fully, openly. Then someone wasn't being careful enough with you, he said. Caleb held his gaze, the mountains in the distance, the horses in the green pasture, the warm April air. You've been careful, Caleb said. I'm trying, Eli said. They looked at each other for a moment in the open afternoon, and in that look was everything they'd built in 7 months, every fence and storm and early morning, an honest conversation and frightened night and brave small gesture, and it was more than enough. It was the kind of enough that makes the future look like a gift you haven't opened yet but already know is the right thing. Eli's hand found his briefly, there in the open pasture with the mountains watching and the horses grazing, warm and real and unashamed. A single moment that asked for no witnesses because it didn't need them. Then he let go, and they stood side by side in the green April afternoon, and the farm breathed around them, and everything was exactly right. There's a moment in every slow burn, if you're paying attention, when you can pinpoint exactly when the thing you hoped for became the thing you have. For Caleb, he could trace it back to a cold October morning when he turned around in a hayfield with his arms burning and found someone watching him with something careful and specific in their gray-green eyes. He could trace it back to 2 words so quiet they should have been swallowed by the open air. Good boy. He understood those words now in a way he hadn't then. Hadn't understood that they were the first honest thing a certain kind of person says to someone they've just recognized. Hadn't understood that Eli Voss communicated in exactly these terms, small, precise, true, and that what he'd said in that hayfield was, for Eli, a kind of declaration. I see you. You're doing well. Something in me has decided to notice. He was still 18. He was still at the beginning of things. He would make mistakes, encounter confusions, have 1,000 more things to figure out. The unmapped territory was still large and waiting. But he would figure them out from here. From this farm, this valley, these mountains. From the side of someone who had taught him by example and by patience that steadiness was possible. That honest was possible. That you could want something openly and work toward it directly and not be destroyed by it. He hauled his first bale of hay that morning with burning arms and the sun barely up, and a face full of determination and absence of joy. And a man watched him from a barn doorway and found something worth noticing. He didn't know then what that would become. He does now.
If the story held something for you, if you recognized any piece of Caleb's fear or Eli's careful offering, or the way a single gesture in the right moment can become an entire season, then you already know why stories like this matter. Like, subscribe, and comments, and tell me which moment hit you hardest. Should I tell you? Thanks for watching and keep watching for more interesting stories on this channel.